You have a BFF. If you're ever in a jam, here I am. If you're ever in a mess, SOS. If you're ever so happy you land in jail, I'm your bail. It's friendship. Friendship, just the perfect blendship. When other friendships have been forgot, ours will still be hot. Yada, 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 dig, 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 whatever that means. Who do you sing Cole Porter to? Do you have a best friend? When you're down and troubled and you need a helping hand and nothing is going right? Who do you close your eyes and think of who will soon be there to brighten up even the darkest night? Winter, spring, summer, or fall. All you got to do is call because you've got a friend. What a great, incredible gift friendship is. We sing odes to it. Every generation sings odes from Cole Porter all the way to Toy Story toddlers. I love that song. That's a theme song for all three Toy Story movies. You got a friend in me. You've got a friend in me when the road looks rough ahead and you're miles and miles from your soft warm bed. Just remember what your old pal said. You've got a friend in me. BFF, best friends forever. Jesus, in the text today, says, you are my friend. No longer do I call you servant, for a servant does not know what his master is doing. I call you my friend. It's amazing, if you stop to think about it, that you can call the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords BFF. It's amazing that you can high five and fist bump the Holy One to whom hallelujahs are sung. It's amazing to be raised up from a servant who has no clue to what his master is doing to suddenly being in the know and being able to look at Jesus and to borrow a line from Tonto, call him Kimasabi, my faithful friend. You know, in some way, it's like being pulled off the Augusta National grounds crew, trading in your white work overalls for a custom-fitted green jacket, being escorted into the champion's locker room. Well, hello, Mr. Nicholas. No, for you it's Jack. It's just Jack. It's almost like trading in your cotton apron and your hairnet and your server's plastic gloves. Help you, sir? Help you? Help you, sir? Coming out of the kitchen and putting on silk couture and sitting down at the head of the table. No longer are you a servant. I call you a friend. How does that make you feel? I revered and feared my theology professor, John Haddon Leith. He was an imposing man, an imposing intellect. He was powerful with authority. He had served the church faithfully in the seminary and as a pastor in the church, so he knew whereof he spoke. And so that first year we sat at his feet as peons, scribbling away at his lectures, never daring to raise a hand to interject a thought. He was something. One night, he invited a small group of us over to his house. Now, that was a cause of fear and trembling. What had we done? We got there. I was nervous. After all, how does a first-year seminary peon carry on a conversation with a theological giant? Well, I remembered Proverbs 17:28. Do you know Proverbs 17:28? It's a good verse. Everybody should know it. Even fools are thought wise when they keep silent. With their mouth shut, they seem intelligent. That's a good verse. Well, he came into the living room, and he didn't say what I thought he might say in his due west South Carolina thick accent. Something like, okay, who can compare and contrast the theology of Arius with the theology of Athanasius at the first Council of Nicaea in 325 AD? I was prepared to answer that question. What he said was, his curmudgeonly voice growing tender, "Who here likes parched peanuts?" Well, I was in shock, but I managed to get my hand halfway up. "Good," he said, "I've got some in the oven." And he brought them in, and we sat down and cracked peanuts and talked about the Atlanta Braves. Kind of amazingly, over the course of the night, I went from being peon to being a friend. It's amazing, isn't it? How does it feel to be raised up like that? I can tell you, it felt good to me. It was a lifelong friendship. Do you know that that curmudgeonly man was the first one to call me when my life fell apart? Because that's what friends do. It's a gift, isn't it? But you know what? I don't think it was my imagination that after that night when we formed friendship over parched peanuts and Braves baseball, he began to expect a little more from me than before. He was a little harder on me than he was before. Because that's the nature of friendship too, isn't it? We expect more out of a friend. You remember Psalm 55? David is in a terrible place. And he says how terrible it is. "My heart is shuddering within me. The terrors of death sweep over me. Horror has overwhelmed me. Fear and trembling grip me. Oh, if I only had the wings of a dove, that I could fly away and find some place that I could rest." Have you ever been in a place like that? Do you know what it is that made David in such a bad place? Someone he had called his friend had betrayed him. "If it had been my enemy," he writes, "I could have hid from him. But you, my companion, my dear friend, for whom I cared. We used to walk to the church together, with the crowd into the house of God. Oh, we expect more from our friends, don't we? So when Jesus says, "You're my friend," I get a little uneasy. It's one thing to sing, "What a friend we have in Jesus." We're going to sing that. It's something completely different to sing, "What a friend Jesus has in me." You see the difference? Oh, there's a difference. Does Jesus have a friend in you? Are you comfortable with that phrase? Confident singing that line? George was. Let me tell you about George. I met George at a community churches meeting. The churches in the community decided we would quit doing our own little thing trying to help the needy, and we would all come together and form an organization jointly. We called it Side by Side. I thought it was a brilliant name. We would join together and we would help together. And we all gathered for that organizational meeting. And at that meeting, George spoke up. Now, it became apparent quickly George did not know Proverbs 17:28. Or if he did, he chose to ignore it. Because once George got started, he could not spell quit. And it seemed like every one of his sentences began with me, myself, and I. And I'm thinking to myself, you sound like Know-It-All University's magna cum laude graduate. Nobody could get a word in edgewise. And in the midst of that rambling, George said something about Jesus being his BFF. Now, I'd never heard that term, And I'm sitting there thinking, BFF, what is that? And then when it became apparent from the context, I thought, on your lips, that seems presumptuous and bumptious. After the meeting, I asked a buddy, Jim, who was that guy? He said, oh, that's just George. He's a Lutheran. As if that explained everything. I just thought to myself, thank God he's not in my church. I don't know about you, but I'm uneasy calling myself Jesus' best friend. I'm not sure anybody can use that sentence. But Jesus says it. I don't call you servant anymore. I call you friend. And why does he say we're friends? Because everything that I have received from my Father, I have shared with you. You see why you're a friend? You're in the know. Everything about God I've shared with you. What God is doing, how he's doing it, why he's doing it, I'm sharing that with you. And you know, don't you, that being a friend and being in the know means you have greater responsibility. And that greater responsibility is a burden sometimes. After church today, we're going to start training new elders and deacons. Some of them are brand new, some of them are old veterans, but we're trying to get them all in the know. Because you can't lead if you're not in the know, right? So they'll stay after school today, and next Sunday, and the next Sunday, and the next Sunday, and the next Sunday, and another day after that. 20 hours of training. That doesn't include the 5 books they're going to take home. I don't know how many hours it'll take for them to wade through all those things. Jesus has called them his friends, and they've answered yes. And because they've answered, they have a burden of greater responsibility. It's enough to make you wonder sometimes. Maybe I should have just been a pew sitter, a servant who could come to church and say, why don't they do something about this? Why don't they do something about that? And then all of a sudden, you're the they. I've had more than one elder or deacon say to me, sometimes I wish I hadn't said yes. Sometimes I feel like I know too much now about all the politics and budgets and bungling and troubles of the church. I wish I could just sit out there and, serve quietly. I wonder if that's not why the prodigal son came home and asked his father if he could be a servant. You know that story, our call to worship. Father, treat me as one of your hired servants. Why? Because I've been in the big house and I screwed up. And I ended up in the outhouse, so I don't want that responsibility again. So I tell you what, you just give me a hoe, and I'll hoe from sunup to sundown, and when the day's over, I'll take off my cap and lay aside the hoe, and I won't worry about things too great and too marvelous for me. And what did the father say to the son? Nonsense. You put on the robe of responsibility. You put on the ring of authority. You put on these shoes that are too big for anyone to fill. You're more than a servant. So maybe being a friend of Jesus isn't such a great gift after all. Maybe it's a burden. Teresa of Avila, a 16th century saint, had a great sense of humor, and she had a playful friendship with Jesus. Once when she was going through a terrible time in her life, one of the 17 Carmelite monasteries she had founded had burned to the ground. Some of the others were in decline. They were short of money. She got on her donkey and went off to raise money when a sudden storm swooped down and knocked her off, and she fell in the mud, and she hurt her leg. And she cried out, Lord, you couldn't have picked a worse time for this to happen. Why did this happen now? The voice, she said, she heard in that inner quiet was, this is the way I treat my friends. And she responded back, Well, if that's the way you treat your friends, it's no wonder you don't have very many of them. Isn't it true? Jesus said so. From those to whom I give much, I will expect much. That's how Jesus said it. So when you're Jesus' friend, you see, you're responsible. And you're particularly responsible to try to be like him. It's worth remembering what he was like. That he loved the unlovely and welcomed the outcast. That he held sinners close to him. That he had one outfit, the one that was on his back, and one pair of shoes. And on the census form that asked for his address, he wrote down none. Homeless. Anybody here really the best friends with this man who made powerful church people mad enough to kill him and willingly gave up his life? To be best friends with Jesus means that we're called to do the same. Anyone who would be my BFF, he says, must deny yourself and take up your cross and follow me. Because if you try to save your life, you're going to lose it. Wouldn't you know it? And on Sunday morning, I looked out in church, and there sitting near the back, about where Wiley's sitting now, was George. There was George. Gave me a start. And then the next Sunday, there was George again in the same spot. And then again. Back again with his awkward, cocky, difficult to love, extra grace required self. God must have heard me when I said, thank God he's not in my church, because God has a funny sense of humor. Because George found himself a new church home. He'd just been there a few Sundays when he came up to me and said, I don't know what you were trying to talk about today, but it didn't make any sense at all. You see what happens? Because George was Jesus' friend, and Jesus had called me friend, I had to be friends with George too. So through gritted teeth, I said, George, well, let's talk about it. Come by and see me this week. He came by. We went at it a little bit. No, we went at it a lot. About theology, about ethics, about the church, about everything. We ran out of time. I said, come back next week. And we went at it again. It wasn't a tea party. Now, I can tell you that. George said to me, you're not preaching the kind of sermons this church needs to hear. And I said, George, you know what? Sometimes you seem arrogant. And you talk too much. He came back every week. And do you know, over the time, I began to understand something about George. I heard about his terrible life in his childhood, being abused and neglected. And I understood that cocksuredness was his survival strategy. You see? He told me about a time he had been fired by a corporation for refusing to cook the books. Oh, he had experienced injustice and hurt in his life. And here's the thing about George. He seemed cocksure in a way because he was sure about Jesus, I mean. Because George was so quirky and weird, most people spurned him, but not Jesus. So George meant it when he said, Jesus is my best friend forever. Quirkiness and all. Just look around you. Isn't it strange who you become friends with once you become friends with Jesus? It's a burden to be friends with Jesus, but it's a burden like wings are to a bird. And Jesus says, there is no greater love than this love, that I would lay down my life for you, my friends. In his book, Free of Charge, Yale theologian Miroslav Volf tells about the day that he took with his wife their 3-month-old adopted son back to see the boy's mother and her 10-year-old daughter, the baby's sibling, for the first time. The first thing I saw, he says, was a tear, a huge, unforgettable tear in the big brown eyes of that 10-year-old girl. And then I saw the tears in the eyes of her mother. And in all the tears, there was enough joy mixed with pain to underscore how deep the pain, the joy of seeing him, their 3-month-old brother and son, and the pain that this was the first time they had seen him since he was 2 days old and they had kissed him goodbye. Wolf says that even though he felt deeply grateful for this child, he still harbored in his heart an ill feeling towards this mother, towards any mother who would give up a baby for any reason. But when they had that visit, his heart changed. The child's birth mother handed him a letter that she had written, and she asked him to read to the boy later. At the end of it, it said simply, "I did this for you. Someday you will understand." Wolf reflects, she loved him for his own sake, and therefore she would rather have suffered his absence for him to flourish than to have enjoyed his presence and for him to languish. Now, he said, it was my turn to cry over the beauty and tragedy of that kind of love. Don't you see? There is no greater love than this, Jesus says, that a man would lay down his life for his friends. It's exactly what God has done for us. What a friend we have in Jesus. Amen. Oh, God, help us that Jesus might have a friend in us. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit.